welcome. You're watching Head to Head. I'm Antonina Antosha with UATV. It's been over 5 years since Russia annexed Crimea and started its hybrid war in eastern Ukraine. Despite numerous attempts by both Ukraine and the international community to resolve the conflict by diplomatic means, peace, or at least a long-lasting ceasefire, has never been achieved in the Donbas. The Kremlin seems determined to destabilize Ukraine, but at the same time reluctant to annex the Donbas as it did with Crimea. So what does Putin really want, and what can be done to end this undeclared war in eastern Ukraine? To talk more about this, we're joined in the studio today by Kuzio. He is a professor of the Department of Political Science at National University of Kyiv Mohyla Academy and an expert in Ukrainian political, economic and security affairs. He's also the author of the book called Putin's War Against Ukraine. Hello, and thank you for coming.
Hello.
First of all, let's talk about your book.
Well, I began writing it during the Euromaidan. It took about sort of 1.5 to 2 years for the research, because I did many visits to the front line of the war, and also traveled extensively in eastern and southern Ukraine, because I wanted to really see how the Russian-speaking population of Ukraine reacts to the war and the annexation, particularly why the so-called New Russia, Novorossiya project failed in 2014. And then from about 2016 to 2017, I wrote it. It appeared in English. It was published in English in the spring of 2017. And then with the help of the Ministry of Information Policy of Ukraine, it was translated into Ukrainian and Russian and published this year, as you can see, by the Dukh i Litera publishing house of Kyiv Mohyla Academy. And since it was published, I've done many book presentations in Western Ukraine. I just came back from the Donbas front line. I was in Avdiivka, Butivka, where I gave many books out to soldiers and to police, Spetsnaz, and other people who were still there in the fighting zone.
Again, the book is called Putin's War Against Ukraine. A lot of people, well, there is a commonly accepted point of view that if it wasn't for Putin, there wouldn't be a war in eastern Ukraine. So a lot of people actually think if Putin is misplaced or gone, then the war would be over. Do you agree?
No. I called it Putin's war against Ukraine, not Russia's war against Ukraine, because it's more a good reflection of Ukrainian public opinion. Ukrainian public opinion is patriotic, not nationalistic. It's patriotic because it blames Putin and the Russian State Duma, the Russian government. It doesn't blame the Russian people for the war. So that's very important to differentiate. But no, if Putin was to die tomorrow fighting a tiger in Siberia somewhere without his shirt on, there are many more Putins in Moscow. And also the views about the Crimea and about the Donbas are very widely presented in the Russian public opinion, including amongst opposition members such as Alexei Navalny, who supports the annexation of Crimea and also believes Ukrainians and Russians are один народ, one people. A recent opinion poll in Russia found 85% of the public with only 10% against, 85% supporting the annexation of the Crimea. So this is not just Putin. There are many, many more people who have such views. To have a lasting peace process in you is very difficult, because for Russia, the Crimea is a close question.
Well, not for the international community, obviously. Just recently, chair of the OSCE, Miroslav Lajchak, named 9 factors that could be implemented in order to resolve the conflict in the east of Ukraine. And one of them, the first one he named, was a ceasefire, right? What else?
Well, I'm not a great optimist about the war ending, because it's not just a question. Well, first of all, as I've mentioned, the Crimea is a close question. So when President Zelensky talks about the need to discuss both the Crimea and Donbas together, Russia will never agree to that. Secondly, Russia only wants the DNR and LNR, those Russian-controlled regions, to come back to Ukraine, not because it doesn't want to annex them. It wants those voters to come back into Ukraine, and then they have an influence, so the opposition bloc, pro-Russian opposition bloc, gets more votes, and that these two regions coming to Ukraine as part of a package. And that package includes what they are proposing in Moldova today, which is federalization of Ukraine, special status for these regions who have a veto power over Kyiv's policies, and that Ukraine gives up on NATO and EU membership, becomes a neutral state. I don't know of any president, except maybe Mr. Boyko, who would agree to this. And I do not believe that President Zelensky would agree to this. He wouldn't get enough votes in parliament, firstly, because you need to change the constitution. That requires 300 votes. Secondly, civil society, nationalists, volunteer groups, veterans are very powerful, and they would protest about this. So Russia's proposals for ending the war are not a compromise. They are basically saying to Ukraine, surrender. I don't know. I mean, I ask all the time, I ask soldiers on the front line about these questions. And by the way, 90% of the soldiers I met on the front line were Russian speakers. From Dnipro, Zaporizhia particularly, Kharkiv. So, you know, these are not sort of crazy West Ukrainian nationalists. These are Russian-speaking Ukrainians who are defending their region of Ukraine. I don't see any support for that kind of package that Russia is proposing. Russia isn't just proposing a sort of a simple peace deal. It's proposing basically a return of Ukraine to Russian sphere of influence. Okay,
in your personal point of view, what could be the way of resolving this conflict, if not diplomatically surrendering to Russia?
Well, I mean, it's extremely difficult when Russia refuses to discuss the Crimea. And, you know, the population of Ukraine and the population of Russia have completely diametrically different views of both the Donbas and the Crimea to each other. So if 85% of Russians think the annexation of Crimea was a good thing, 80% of Ukrainians, the same number, think it was a bad thing, that they should be returned. So how do you deal with this? The proposal that President Poroshenko made, and which Western governments support, and OSCE, United Nations, is to have peacekeepers in the Donbas, United Nations peacekeepers.
Which is a very good idea, but will Russia ever allow it?
Well, this is the point, that actually originally it was a proposal made by Vladimir Putin, but then he obviously was overtaken by events, because his idea is to do the traditional one of, like in Pridnestrovia, in Moldova, in Abkhazia, South Ossetia, is to put peacekeepers on the front line, on the conflict line, which then just freezes the conflict in Russia's favor. Whereas Ukraine and Western governments, OSCE, want them to go on the border, or the Russian-Ukrainian border. But of course, Putin knows that if they put peacekeepers on the Russian-Ukrainian border, that returns the border to Ukrainian control, which is one of the demands of the Minsk agreements. And secondly, it means the collapse of DNR, LNR. DNR, these two Russian-controlled regions are completely dependent on Russia for financial, economic, and military means. So without Russia having the ability to support them, they would simply collapse. Because this is an artificial war. There's no ethnic conflict here. I mean, there are Russian speakers on both sides. It's not an ethnic sort of divide like it is in, say, Georgia, between Abkhaz and Georgians. It's completely artificial, and it was only created, this war, by Russian intervention. If there had not been Russian intervention 5 years ago, there would have been violence on the street between pro-Maidan, anti-Maidan, but nothing else, not a war. So this is all down to Russia. I think that the best that we can do, and President Zelensky has already called for this, is to increase the amount of sanctions on Russia. Russia today is in a very bad situation.
So basically drain it economically?
I think you need to yes, you need to increase the number of sanctions, as President Zelensky has already called for this, but you also need to call and define and declare Russia to be a terrorist state. Just a few days ago, another Russian-backed terrorist was caught in Kharkiv trying to plant a bomb in a factory. So it's long overdue. This would be a radical step because it would place Russia in the same level as North Korea, Iran. But that's what Russia is today. It's supporting terrorism inside Ukraine. I think it's very difficult to see how there can be a potential peace outcome because the demands that Russia is making are too much for, never mind President Poroshenko, but even for President Zelensky. And the opposition bloc will not have a chance ever to return back to power. They don't have the support in Ukraine anymore. And they don't have the voters inside Ukraine. So we are in a long, drawn-out stalemate. Ukrainian opinion polls, by the way, you're right, that they associate the war with Putin. So they think that
For some reason.
As long as Putin's in power, there will be no solution. But what they all forget, what Ukrainians forget, is that Putin is president for life.
What's that official information?
Well, of course, it's not official information. Of course, he will never say this. But there's no. If you understand the Russian political system, you know.
And if you read between the lines, then yes, he is president.
He cannot leave power because then he's finished. Yeah. He could go to jail. He could lose what he's stolen. He's the biggest oligarch in Russia. So,
speaking of jail, is there any chance that the International Court in The Hague will ever rule out in favor of Ukraine and Putin will end up behind bars?
No, Putin will never end up behind bars because we have double standards in international relations. If you have nuclear weapons, then you will always be able to get away with things, right? Milosevic went to The Hague, the Serbian leader, but he did not have nuclear weapons. And no, I mean, Russia is a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, so it would always veto anything like that. Plus, both Russia and the United States are not members. They've both left the International Criminal Court. So, I mean, Russia will be in a very difficult situation because all these various court cases that Ukraine is doing against Russia in the Maritime Court, in the court in the Hague International Court of Justice, Russia is going to lose them. And this will be the first case in world history, where Russia, a country, is refusing to abide by the decisions of these international courts. And that could create massive problems for Russia because Ukraine will be allowed by international law, therefore, to take over control of Russian property abroad. So I don't think. I think the situation could potentially get far worse before it gets better, unfortunately. And I don't see any optimism that this war will end soon. Sadly, at least not until 2024, when Putin finishes his current term in office. Which is the same year as Zelensky.
Well, we'll be all eagerly waiting for 2024. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
That was Taras Kuzio. He's a professor of the Department of Political Science at the National University of Kyiv Mohyla Academy and an expert in Ukrainian political, economic, and security affairs. Thank you so much for watching UATV. Stay tuned for more.